So here we are. I basically spent about the last year, a little bit more, assimilating this various material because I was really curious. As I traveled around, I noticed that people had a ton of different vents on all this stuff, and I started to wonder about it more and more as I met various people. I met a lady down in Colorado Springs who's a friend of Michael and Ruth's, named Jessica Saunders, who ran this bookstore for a while. She had a rather fascinating observation to me. She'd been doing some clairvoyant research for some people who make this little thing called an analyte, or clarius, whichever. Who did the same thing. Yeah.
Could you speak just a little bit louder?
Sure.
Please?
Sure.
Thank you.
And she had noticed two different glyphs over the heads of Reiki masters that she'd encountered. One that was like a lightning bolt and one that was a spiral. And so that got me thinking about it. I mean, that was a real metaphoric thing to her, you know, and people that see energy usually see it real metaphorically. I mean, one of the problems that you have in researching any energetic process is that it's really tough to find a handful of people that see the energy field exactly the same way so that you can compare and correlate data. That's really tough. So usually what you wind up doing is, is narrowing it down more and more and picking up people as you go around. Well, she had this interesting bent on it. I thought that glyph thing was very interesting. Because clearly in her psychology and in her framework, that represented two different currents within Reiki, and I'd never really considered that before. So that sort of launched me into some of the later stages of this research, and that was earlier this year, sometime like February maybe. I don't remember. It's been a while. So I traveled around and I accumulated materials and I met interesting people, and I'm going to try my best to relate those experiences to you here today. As well as give you a good overview of all of that. Let's start at the beginning with the history of Reiki as it's been presented. You know, we've all heard this great story. It's in every traditional mainline book, and I've got a lot of books here and a lot of materials. Everything's sitting up on this table, with the exception of my little private world over here, is for you guys to peruse and look through, and it's just a collection of really different oddball stuff, some of the really unique, weird attunement processes and things that I've run across that are extremely unusual and very out of the ordinary and stuff like that. So anything that you want off of that table, Anne can more than make copies for you. I don't know what she charges for that. I keep my hands pretty well away from all of that. But feel free to write down and give her a holler. And we'll talk about them sort of as we go through. Beginning with this story of Reiki, everybody's looked at this. I come from this really theologian type family, where there's a bunch of like right-wing theologians. So they love me, you know.
Just tell them the title of the book you're in for.
Which one? Oh, Rush Limbaugh and the Bible. Yeah. And one of them pointed out as I was getting into this, and I'm sending him materials and all of this, that there's this large chunk of inaccuracy in the traditional stories that's been presented. So that sort of got me thinking about what other large chunks of inaccuracy might be in the. And the part that he picked up on was the whole Usui, head of a Christian school in Japan about that time frame. Because that was essentially the only schools there were from his particular sort of sect. Interesting term to use with Christianity, but his particular sect of Christianity. And he said, that's pretty ludicrous. There's no way that he would have even been allowed to teach there, much less anything else. I mean, the faculties were completely missionary run. And then he went on to enlighten me as to the other things, about outcast from society and all of that. So that got me looking at the story. So let's go through it here real quick, sort of from the beginning in a reasonably traditional way that it's been presented. Those of you that have heard this before can barrel on. Trust me, more stuff's added at the end as usual. We have this Christian president or educator of a Christian school in Kyoto, Japan, presented to us from Mrs. Takata, and really everything that we know about Reiki at this point comes from Mrs. Takata. So, here goes the story, and one of his students comes up to him and asks him, if he can perform miracles, like, he believes the Bible is true, and he says, well, of course, and they say, well, then let's see a miracle, and he says, what do you mean, can you do that? And decides that his faith is, slightly in question. And so allegedly launches off on this huge search around the world, and he goes to the University of Chicago and studies there for a period of years, maybe gets a degree, maybe doesn't, depending on the story. Comes home, not finding anything that he wanted in Christianity, sort of more disillusioned than ever, and winds up, remembering hearing about Buddha vaguely and all of that, and doing the monastic system thing, and going through the various sutras and ending up in Sanskrit, and blah, 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 blah. Well, let's dissect this a little bit from here. First of all, no Christian school in Kyoto, Japan has ever heard of him. There's two. Neither one of them has ever heard of the guy. And neither has any university in Chicago. Originally it started off with people just saying the University of Chicago, and then when it started to get widely circulated, the University of Chicago had no record of the guy. And so then the story kind of changed, in the publications. So, well, it was just a university in Chicago, so the rest of the University of Chicago never heard of him either. So then that takes us to the point of the story with going back to Japan. Vaguely remember hearing about the Buddhism and all of that, and entering the monastic system and all that. Certainly it's much more logical for me to assume that the guy was a Buddhist monk. So we'll take it from that framework from here on out. Why the Christian bend? Keep in mind that Takata's background was that of a partially Japanese citizen living about the time when Americans were rounding up their Japanese citizens of questionable whatever and throwing them into camps in the desert. Now, her main client was in California at this time, which is where they were doing that heavily. They were pretty much leaving you alone in Hawaii, where she lived. But her main client was in California, where they were just sweeping the streets and tossing people into these camps. So, given that, would you be stupid enough to stand up and say that you have this great Buddhist system of healing, and nail the coffin shut, and volunteer to walk to one of the camps? It seems sort of more logical to me that you put a Christian spin on it. And so that's, I think, probably where it all came from. And it's done no harm. I mean, if anything, it's gotten much more widespread acceptability than it would have otherwise, because that little spin was put on it. And nobody, the stuff works really well, as everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, or you wouldn't be here. So, nobody bothered to check any of the story that she said, because who cared? If the system works, it must work. And I tell you about this revised history because that theory works both ways. You will run across people who will be able to dissect that story. Folks like one of my uncles who just picked an obscure part of it, but nonetheless an important part of it, and they'll look at you and they'll say, well, if that's not true, if the basis of the whole thing isn't true, then why should I believe anything else that comes out of your mouth from here on out? So, the fact that this has a ubiquitous, beginning shrouded in mystery, I don't think should be any big deal necessarily. What doesn't? All of Cartesian science was founded by Descartes, having a vision of an angel in a dream that told him that nature could be conquered by the sum of numbers and measurement. There you go. Welcome to science. It was founded by an angel. So everything has sort of its mystical roots at some point, and certainly science still thrives on intuitive discovery. Okay, so we'll move from there up into some of the other stuff. A lot of the materials out there say that the symbols were discovered in the sutras, and if you went back to the Sanskrit sutras and all of this. If you went back to the original sutras, they weren't in Sanskrit, they were in sort of an offshoot dialect of it. So that's another off part of the story. Also, if you look at the symbols and have a series of encyclopedic stuff available to you, you recognize pretty quickly that they're not anywhere in any Sanskrit dictionary that you're going to find. In fact, two of them are, so remarkably close to Japanese that if you hand them to someone who is Japanese, they can read them. That's not exactly ancient Sanskrit. Also, all of the names are in Japanese, so I think that's very interesting. And I have heard questions about whether or not you could translate the names into English and use that. So maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. Certainly a valid part of the story to me would seem the empowerment and through meditation on the mountain, all of that. I think that's pretty legit. That seems like a pretty solid part of the story. Anybody that meditates knows that it comes through your own consciousness. You know, you filter the stuff yourself. And in this case, it was the consciousness of a Japanese man living, you know, before the turn of the century, and so the symbols are Japanese, you know, two of them, as well as all of the names. You know, so that makes a certain degree of sense. And it does work. It does work very well. So, you know, this is all just so people won't pull your pants down and say, well, if you don't know that, how do you know anything else? Also, moving on from there in time, you know, we have Takata becoming a master, and there's questions about when that happened. And gee, if I only had a book. Let me see if this is in here. Almost getting difficult to keep up on revisions of the manual for class. On this page, in the back, there is one of Takata's original certificates. This has been circulating for years. And I think this is a very telling thing. Maybe she was initiated before leaving Hawaii, maybe not. It doesn't really matter. Her certificate is dated 21st of February, 1938. When you look through this, you have a lot of, this is the only document, this is the only piece of Reiki that doesn't come from Hayo Takata. You know, so this is really the only piece of sort of impartial history that we're left with, at least right now. Unless, you know, the Hayashi clan really early had at some point. And when you look at this, it says simply, this is to certify that Mrs. Hayo Takata, an American citizen born in the territory of Hawaii, after a course of study and training in the Usui system of Reiki healing undertaken under my personal supervision during a visit to Japan in 1935, and subsequently, has a nice run-on sentences that Hayashi did, has passed all the tests and proved worthy of and capable of administering the treatment and of conferring the power of Reiki on others. Therefore, I, Dr. Shiro Hayashi, by virtue of my authority as a master of the Usui Reiki system of drugless healing, interesting name for it, huh? Not exactly what you see in the Usui Light Healer Association is in one book and all that. Well, here's what Hayashi called it. You know, that's a very interesting thing because that completely died out. You know, you never hear that anymore. Of drugless healing, do hereby confer upon Mrs. Hayo Takata the full power and authority to practice the Reiki system and to impart to others the secret knowledge and the gift of healing under this system. Mrs. Hayo Takata is hereby certified by me as a practitioner and master of Dr. Usui's Reiki system of healing. At this time, the only person in the United States authorized to confer similar powers on others, and one of 13 fully qualified as a master of the profession. Signed this 21st day of February 1938 in the city and county of Honolulu, territory of Hawaii. And those of you who are radionics will know the signature by Hayashi. That might be fun to play with. And at the bottom, a little certificate signifying it was from the territory of Hawaii's records. On file, easy to get. Now, let's tear this apart a little bit. You know, that I find the sentence, certified by me as a practitioner and master of Dr. Usui's system of healing, at this time the only person in the United States authorized to confer similar powers on others, and one of 13 fully qualified as a master of the profession, to be the most telling paragraph in this entire thing. And I say that simply because nowhere in this Hayashi identify himself as anything other than one of those 13 people. You know, it's not some subtitle under his name. It's not some holier than thou thing. He's saying, you can do what I do. So here is the only document that doesn't come from Takata, and fortunately it's a document that makes the playing field level as far as the Reiki community is concerned. So it's kind of a good thing to throw in the face of dogmatists that you run against and say the exact opposite. So anyway, I always include that in there. I think it's kind of neat. And then, oddly enough, the manual that I have is a little older because it has correspondences to all the hand positions and stuff in there. I wanted to keep it so. Now that I've given away my manual, I'm going to be borrowing Mary's. I have a feeling that I might have looked through that.
You want to keep it? For the moment.
Yeah, we'll write it down. So, Mrs. Takata learns Reiki, and Reiki comes to the United States, and somewhere in there, 22 official masters are listed, 28 unofficial masters, according to various Reiki histories and lineages and stuff. Some of these being as ubiquitous as simply people that she was working on and